Okay, we are in chapter 5, developing a training foundation. This is the third presentation, and we are on step 6 of developing a training foundation. So there's practical tips. Uh, may or may not be scientific evidence of these tips, and this is where you may get practical tips talking with other athletes, with other coaches, with other people who are doing endurance events. And you just want to be careful about the tips that you're getting, and you do want to be critically evaluating and making sure that the tips make sense and that they aren't introducing a risk of injury to you. But the tips may be built around proper breathing or breathing rate, how the breathing may correspond with your cadence. Training with a company or training with different people can be a practical tip if you're in group settings. You want to make sure that you're choosing safe routes for yourself, safe being both physically as well as safe in terms of avoiding the risk of injury, like trail running. You need to be careful about the type of trail you run on. You do want to be careful about the stretching and the strengthening that you're doing on a regular basis, uh, and what is appropriate. You do want to be careful in both of these worlds. You want to be eating the correct thing. I've written here, eat what your body dictates. That's actually really just some uh, that you know, yeah. You got to spend some time figuring out what the right diet is. And when I originally put this presentation together, this was probably some decent advice, but now I would say you need to really our understanding of endurance nutrition has probably gotten much better over the last 5 to 10 years, and we've got to really pay attention to the amount of carbohydrates, the amount of fat you're eating, the type of carbohydrate, the type of fat you're eating, sources of protein, things like that. So you do need to try to be as educated as you can in that area. You do need to get enough sleep. You need to be sensible about weather conditions. Here in the Las Vegas area, you got to be careful exercising in the really hot temperatures. And you want to be careful not to let running or endurance exercise in general become a cause of stress, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Step 7, start with a planned training program. Again, this has to match what your goals are. If your goals have to do with just weight loss, then your training program may be really quite simple. If your goal is to complete an endurance event, complete a marathon or an Ironman, your training program may be a little bit more detailed. If you're trying to PR, now your training program probably needs to be dialed in a little bit more. Great advice for a beginner runner or someone doing the first marathon or Ironman is to follow a published training program, something that's free. And then you start working more into something more detailed based upon your goals. And I put here, there does seem to be some value in run walk programs. So some training programs will talk about a run walk pacing strategy, especially for marathon or ultra marathon. Step 8, enter progressively longer races. Now, this is interesting. I talk with a lot of people, and this is great advice. Start off with a 5K, do a 10K, maybe a half marathon, and then try a marathon. But there's a lot of people that really enjoy the challenge of doing a big event, like a marathon, like an Ironman or a half Ironman. And so a lot of times people will jump from doing nothing to doing something like a big challenge. But in general, it's probably good to progress over those different distances. Race day techniques, you got to practice those. You have to understand them, and that's why sometimes it's better to do shorter races, which allow you to figure out some race day techniques before you do that big race. But some people enjoy the big challenge. Step 9, you want to learn from personal experience, and this is why it is important to have a really good training log, either an electronic log or a analog pen to paper type of log. But you really want to pay attention to how your body responds to a training stimulus, how your body responds on race day, how you've done with your taper. In your training log, you try to keep track of injuries and you try to identify patterns that might cause an injury. or train routines that reduce the risk of injury. Write down things related to your equipment. When did you buy your last pair of shoes? How many miles did your shoes have before you changed them out? You try to really have as much detail as possible to try to understand how you are responding to the training stimulus. Uh, Undergo a relatively short peaking period of 3 to 5 weeks and monitor results. What that means is that if you want to have a race that you are trying to PR, you really only pick a few races out a year that you say, this is my key race, or these are my 3 key races. And I'm going to build everything around that. Because you can only peak your fitness for so long, because the model of stress adaptation injury, you'll eventually get to an injured state if you do not allow your body a chance to back off and adapt even over a long period of time. So I want to be careful about that. All right, these are just quicker ones. Just to go over step 10, set realistic training and racing goals. This is so important. And it's important to have a realistic goal so that when you do cross that finish line, you can look at it and say, wow, you know what, that was a big accomplishment. Unfortunately, I see far too many people try to set these goals that they just are not ready to attain. And they cross the finish line and they aren't able to take a moment and really celebrate what they just achieved. So it is really, you got to really spend quite a bit of time with yourself if you're the athlete, or with your athlete if you're coaching, or if you're being coached, that your coach is talking with you about this, to make sure that you have realistic goals for race day. Set your long training goals. That is a good way to create that sustainable, consistent training program. And those training goals are not always performance metric based. Maybe it's frequency of exercise. Maybe it's being able to do some crazy hike, or incorporate some other types of sports throughout the year. They do not always need to be performance metrics. Step 12, decide whether to alternate training volumes weekly, tri-weekly. Our body doesn't always respond to a 7-day period. And you may actually find that your body cycles more on a 10-day period. And those are important things to note. And you only note that by keeping a good training log. The advantage of a 7-day week is our Monday seems to be the same business wise or work wise, or sometimes family wise, and Tuesday, and so forth. So our schedules can be consistent, but your body may not always respond to that period of time. So you do want to keep that in mind, and how to alternate your volumes of training. Step 13, view each race as a scientific experiment. It's sort of true, but you try to approach each race with, if you're trying to improve your performance, caveat, then you try to approach each race as a way to say what worked and what didn't work. Uh, what type of equipment was the right type of equipment? What was the right race pace strategy? Should I start off fast? Should I start off slow? Um, what nutrition worked? What nutrition didn't work? What type of clothing worked for a particular weather day? You try to really pay attention and take in all the details, so then you can make, as best as possible, objective decisions for how to adjust your training program, or how to avoid certain things, or how to incorporate or when to incorporate certain things to maximize your chance to have your best performance. Step 14, beware of the selfish runner syndrome. Okay, this is just endurance athletes in general. Because you're training for endurance events, the um, likelihood of putting in a lot of time training is strong. And you do need to be careful that, if it's holiday season, you spend time with your family, and you're not so worried about going out during your holiday and saying, well, I still need to go run 10 miles, or I got to go for this bike mile or bike ride. And then you're not spending time with family. Anecdotally, I'll tell you, there's far too many people get involved with Ironman races specifically, and their relationships suffer terribly. We call them iron divorces, where a couple may ultimately go in different directions because one person is really spending a lot of time doing the training and not putting in time on the relationships and the work and what have you. So you do need to be careful about endurance sports because you can be drawn into volume of time in the training program. All right, so develop a training foundation. Yeah, 14 rules. I thought there was 15. I remember missing one. But anyways, these laws, these rules, these laws, these steps. These are pieces of advice to follow, and a lot of them are anecdotes, but there is a lot of science behind this, and really the adaptation model of stress recovery adaptation is really the basis for building a training program and ultimately achieving the fitness goals that you want. Okay, the main point of this chapter is to present the information on factors to consider when developing a training program. Think about the underlying physiology explanation of these models or these steps or these laws. I think that's important. But remember that understanding run performance or endurance performance, it's really a function of understanding all aspects of exercise science, from biomechanics, motor control, motor learning, psychology, and physiology, nutrition, injury, sports medicine. These are all important factors to understand to ultimately understand limits to performance and how to achieve peak endurance performance. Remember, anecdotal information is important, but you always want to seek out the empirical evidence and then balance that with the anecdotes. Okay, that's chapter 5. Thanks, everybody.